For 7 years, the CEO never noticed him. One night, seeing him with another woman froze her in place. The rain started without warning. One moment the evening was dry. The next, water hammered against the restaurant windows in fat, angry drops that distorted the city beyond into abstract shapes of light and shadow. Victoria Sinclair didn't notice. She was too focused on the spreadsheet glowing on her phone screen, too absorbed in quarterly projections and profit margins to care about weather. This was her world. Numbers, control, the satisfaction of knowing exactly what would happen next because she'd already calculated every variable. She sat at her private table in the restaurant's upper level, separated from the common dining area by a glass partition that allowed her to observe without being observed. This was how she preferred to operate. Watching, analyzing, never truly seen. The moment her eyes landed on him, something shifted in the restaurant's energy, not dramatically, not obviously, but perceptibly, like a frequency changing on a radio nobody knew was playing. The man stood near the bar, waiting for a table. His suit was charcoal gray, expensive in the way that whispered rather than shouted. His shoulders were broad enough that the fabric had to be custom-tailored, but it wasn't the suit that made Victoria's breath catch. It was his face. She recognized him instantly. Marcus Williams, night maintenance. The man who appeared in her building after dark and vanished before dawn, like a ghost that kept the machinery running. She'd seen him exactly 3 times in her entire career at the company, 3 times in passing, 3 times without really looking. He was the kind of invisible that came from being black in spaces not designed for him, the kind that came from understanding how to move through the world without making anyone uncomfortable. Except now, he was unmistakably visible. And he wasn't alone. The woman arrived a moment later. She wore an emerald dress that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and she moved with the kind of certainty that belonged to people who'd never questioned their right to occupy space. Her skin was rich with undertones of amber and copper. Her hair was braided and pinned close to her head in a style that spoke of intention and care. She was, without question, beautiful. But more than that, she was looking at Marcus like he was the most important human being in her entire field of vision. Victoria watched as the hostess led them to a table directly across the restaurant, positioned perfectly so that Victoria could see every interaction without obstruction. Marcus pulled the woman's chair out. Not as a performance, not as an antiquated gesture, as something automatic, something that lived in his muscle memory, something that suggested a man who knew how to treat someone he valued. The woman sat. Marcus sat across from her, and then he reached across the table and took her hand. The action was simple, intimate, devastating. Victoria's phone slipped from her fingers. It landed on the edge of the table, balanced precariously for a moment before falling to the floor. The screen shattered on impact. People turned. The sound had been loud enough to break through the ambient noise of the restaurant. Marcus looked up directly at Victoria's position, though Victoria wasn't sure he could see her through the partition and the distance. But she felt seen anyway. The woman was speaking to him. Her lips moved. Her expression was serious. Marcus nodded, listening with complete concentration, the kind of attention that suggested her words were changing something inside him, rearranging his architecture at the cellular level. Victoria strained to hear, but the partition between them was soundproof. She could only observe, only watch, only try to decode what was happening from body language and glances and the way Marcus's hand never left the woman's. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The woman pulled a folder from beneath the table, a real folder, physical documents, the kind of evidence that belonged in courtrooms or police stations. Marcus opened it. His jaw tightened. He flipped through pages, and with each page, something in his expression hardened. Fear, determination, the kind of resolve that comes from knowing you're about to do something that will change everything. Victoria realized she was holding her breath. A server approached their table with water and menus. The woman waved him away without breaking eye contact with Marcus. Whatever was happening at that table was larger than hunger, larger than the social performance of dinner. This was something real. And Victoria, who'd spent 20 years perfecting the art of not caring about things that didn't appear on balance sheets, suddenly cared more than she'd cared about anything in her adult life. The woman leaned close. She said something that made Marcus's eyes close for a moment, as if he were processing a blow. Then his eyes opened, and he looked directly at the woman, and there was something in that look that made Victoria understand, with absolute clarity, that he loved her. The realization hit like vertigo. Victoria gripped the edge of her table. Her other hand went to her chest. Something was happening to her body, something she didn't have the vocabulary for because she'd spent years training herself not to feel it. A tightness in her throat, a heat in her face, a feeling that might have been jealousy if she'd allowed herself to feel jealousy, which she didn't, because jealousy was a waste of mental resources. Except she was feeling it. Unmistakably. Not jealousy of Marcus. Jealousy of the woman. Jealousy of the certainty in her eyes, the way she looked at him like she'd made a decision about his value and would defend that decision with her life. Jealousy of the ease with which she occupied space at his table, like she belonged there, like years of history had cemented her right to be exactly where she was. Victoria had never looked at anyone that way. She'd never allowed anyone to look at her that way. The woman gathered the documents back into the folder. Marcus didn't try to stop her. He simply watched her pack them away, and then he did something that shattered something inside Victoria's chest. He reached across the table and tucked a strand of the woman's hair behind her ear. The gesture was tender, reverent, the kind of touch that suggested he'd done it 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times again, and each time it would matter. Victoria stood abruptly. Her chair scraped backward with a sound that turned heads. She didn't care. She needed air. She needed distance. She needed to stop watching the one scene that made it impossible to ignore how completely she'd misread an entire human being. She moved toward the bathroom, forcing herself to walk at a pace that suggested control, that suggested she wasn't falling apart from the inside, that suggested the woman in the emerald dress hadn't just shattered her understanding of who Marcus Williams was and what he was worth. In the bathroom, Victoria locked herself in a stall and pressed her palms against the cold metal door. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman she recognized but didn't know. Expensive blazer, perfectly blown-out hair, eyes that looked hollow. When had she become this? A person who'd built her entire life around avoiding connection, around maintaining distance, around convincing herself that vulnerability was a character flaw rather than a feature of being human. She stayed in that bathroom for 11 minutes. When she emerged, she made sure Marcus and the woman were no longer at their table. The folder was gone. The chairs had been cleared. There was no evidence they'd ever been there at all. But Victoria knew what she'd seen, and she knew she'd have to deal with it. Marcus Williams had been invisible for so long that invisibility had become his native state. At 38, he'd learned to move through Chen manufacturing like a ghost, present but unnoticed, necessary but uncredited, valuable but unseen. His daughter, Amara, was 8 years old, and she'd learned to read the language of his silence, the way he moved when money was tight, the subtle shifts in his demeanor that suggested he was carrying more than he could hold. He'd once been an engineer, a real one, before Amara's mother died, before grief had reorganized his life into something smaller, more private, more focused on the one thing that mattered. Before he'd understood that standing out was dangerous, that ambition attracted attention, that visibility could cost him the one relationship that kept him anchored to the world. The woman in the emerald dress was Dr. Sienna Cole. She was a corporate investigator, hired quietly by the board's external counsel to look into financial irregularities that had been growing larger with each quarterly report. She'd been Marcus's friend since college, back when he was still someone who believed in the future, who thought his talent would protect him, who didn't yet understand how the world punished black men for being too visible. "They've stolen everything," Sienna had told him over the phone, her voice urgent and low. "Your work, your designs, your innovations, everything that made you valuable at that company is being credited to George Morgan and his team. Millions in profit, millions that should belong to you." Marcus had wanted to say no. He'd wanted to tell her he didn't care anymore, that the money didn't matter, that all that mattered was keeping Amara safe and stable and away from the kind of scrutiny that could hurt her. But Sienna had reminded him of something his younger self had known. "You have a daughter. What do you teach her about integrity if you stay silent while people steal from you?" So he'd agreed, reluctantly, to meet her, to review the evidence, to decide whether he was brave enough to make a choice that would change everything. The next morning, Victoria did something completely out of character. She requested the personnel file for Marcus Williams, not through normal channels, directly, from Amanda in Human Resources, with a tone that made it clear this wasn't a request she expected to be questioned. Amanda hesitated. "Is there a specific concern, Victoria? Marcus has an excellent maintenance record, no infractions, no—" "Just get me the file," Victoria said. When the file arrived, Victoria read every word. She read about his hire date 7 years ago. She read about his performance evaluations, all of which were exceptional. She read about the notes in his file, requests for schedule changes, documented but denied, permission to take unpaid leave, requests for flexible hours to accommodate his daughter's school schedule, all of them flagged in red by someone named George Morgan with comments like, "not a team player," and "lacking commitment." Victoria had trusted George Morgan completely. He was her CFO, her financial right hand, the man she relied on for every major decision, and he'd systematically denied accommodations to a man who'd proven nothing but excellence. She dug deeper. She pulled up financial records from the maintenance department. She looked at project attribution, and that's when she found it. A technical report dated 4 years ago, solving a critical inventory problem that had been costing the company millions annually. The solution was brilliant, elegant, the kind of engineering that suggested genuine genius. The author listed on the official report was George Morgan, but Victoria had seen handwriting on Marcus's termination request from 3 years ago, a request he'd submitted when his daughter was ill and he needed flexibility. The same penmanship was scrawled on the original technical report. This report belonged to Marcus. Victoria sat in her office as the implications crystallized. George Morgan wasn't just denying accommodations to a single father. He was stealing intellectual property. He was building his reputation and his compensation on work he didn't do, created by a man he'd systematically erased from record. And Victoria, in her infinite wisdom, had believed every word George told her about Marcus Williams. The jealousy she'd felt at the restaurant shifted into something else. Shame, clarity, the painful understanding that she'd done exactly what the world had been designed to do to people like Marcus. She'd rendered him invisible. Victoria found Marcus the following evening in the maintenance level of Chen Manufacturing. He was standing before a wall of circuit boards, checking connections with the kind of precision that suggested he was thinking about something else entirely. He didn't look up when she entered. "I need to ask you something," Victoria said without preamble. "Who is the woman?" Marcus turned slowly. His expression registered surprise, then something more guarded. "I'm not sure that's relevant to your company operations." "The woman in the emerald dress," Victoria continued. "Who is she, and what was she doing with you at Aurelius last night?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "With respect, ma'am, that's my personal business." "I saw you with documents," Victoria pressed. "Folders, something important. I want to know what's happening." Marcus looked at her directly then, really looked at her, and in his eyes, Victoria saw something she'd never expected to see. Pity, like he was looking at a broken thing and trying to decide if it was worth fixing. "You fired me," Marcus said quietly. 3 years ago, you approved George Morgan's recommendation to let me go, said I wasn't committed to company values, said I was distracting the team. Don't you remember?" Victoria did remember. Or rather, she remembered approving the termination. She didn't remember the reasoning. She didn't remember caring about Marcus Williams at all. "I don't understand," she said finally. "No," Marcus agreed. "You don't, but maybe you should." He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. It was the technical report, the original, his name on it, his signature in the corner. "This is worth approximately $4 million in licensing fees," Marcus said calmly. George Morgan sold these designs to 3 different manufacturing companies while claiming credit for the work. He's been doing this for years, with multiple employees, all of them people like me. Black, vulnerable, easily discredited if they complained. Victoria felt the room tilt. Everything she'd built, everything she'd believed about George, everything she'd assumed about Marcus. All of it was wrong. "The woman," Victoria whispered. "Who is she?" "Someone who cares about things that matter," Marcus said. "Unlike some people." He walked past her, out of the maintenance level, out of the building, and Victoria understood with sudden clarity that she'd just lost something irreplaceable. Not because she wanted Marcus romantically, but because she'd lost the opportunity to be someone better than she'd been. The federal investigation started 3 days later. Sienna Cole had filed complaints with the SEC, provided evidence of systematic fraud, and triggered a cascade of inquiries that would take months to unwind. George Morgan was arrested. His accounts were frozen. His carefully constructed empire of stolen credit and misappropriated wealth collapsed in the span of 48 hours. And Victoria was left to contemplate the part she'd played. Not in the theft, but in the invisibility, in the willingness to not see, in the convenient trust she'd placed in someone who benefited from keeping her blind. She resigned as CEO before the board could force her out, not as an act of noble self-sacrifice, but as an acknowledgement of a simple truth. She'd proven she couldn't be trusted to lead people when she couldn't even see them. It took her 6 weeks to find Marcus. He was working at a small manufacturing firm across town, a company that valued expertise over pedigree, that believed in crediting work to the people who did it. She found him in a lab coat, teaching a younger engineer the finer points of hydraulic systems. He was patient, kind, the way a man teaches when he actually cares if the person learns. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said without preamble. Marcus looked up. His expression didn't change. "Multiple apologies, actually," Victoria continued. "For not seeing you. For trusting George over your credibility. For approving your termination without question. For looking at you in that restaurant and assuming things that had nothing to do with who you actually are." Marcus set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag. "Apologies are free," he said. "They don't cost anything. What matters is whether your actions change." "I've spent the last 6 weeks examining that," Victoria said. "And I've come to understand that I built my entire identity on the assumption that people weren't worth knowing. That connection was weakness. That visibility was vulnerability. I treated you, I treat most people, like obstacles to work around, rather than humans to see." "Okay," Marcus said. He wasn't being cold. He wasn't being warm. He was being honest. "What changed?" "I watched you look at someone like she mattered," Victoria said simply. "I watched you touch her like you'd made a decision about her value that nothing in the world could shake. And I realized I'd never been looked at that way. I'd never looked at anyone that way. I'd constructed an entire life specifically to avoid that kind of vulnerability." Marcus studied her face for a long moment. "That's not my problem to fix," he said finally. "I know," Victoria agreed, "but I'm going to try to fix it myself. And I wanted you to know why, because you deserve to know that your value isn't determined by whether I see it. But also, you should know that I see it now. And I'm sorry for how long it took." She left before Marcus could respond. She didn't ask him to come back to Chen Manufacturing. She didn't ask him to forgive her. She didn't ask him for anything, because she'd finally understood that asking for things was another form of the same selfishness that had defined her career. What she did instead was quietly, systematically, rebuild the company she'd inherited into something different. She created systems that credited work to the people who did it. She established policies that protected single parents and caregivers. She hired investigators to find every instance of stolen intellectual property and made restitution. She removed the people who'd benefited from invisibility and hired people who believed in making others visible. It took months, then a year, then longer. And then one evening, Marcus appeared at her office door. He wasn't there for employment. He was there because Sienna, Dr. Cole, had asked him to deliver a message. The federal investigation had been completed. George Morgan had been convicted. Multiple lawsuits had been settled, and Marcus had received compensation for every innovation that had been stolen from him. "I'm not here to reconcile with you," Marcus said. "But I wanted to see the woman Sienna said was trying to change things." Victoria stood. "And? What do you think?" "I think actions matter," Marcus said. "I think you're trying. I'm not sure if you'll succeed, but I think you're trying." "That's all I can do," Victoria said. Marcus nodded. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The woman in the emerald dress," he said without turning around. "Her name is Dr. Sienna Cole. She's the person who gave me the courage to be visible, to matter, to believe that someone might see me and value me anyway." "Is she your partner?" Victoria asked. "She's my friend," Marcus said. "The best kind of friend. The kind who sees you completely and loves you anyway." He left, and Victoria understood that she'd spent her entire life looking for that. Real connection, genuine seeing, authentic love, while simultaneously doing everything possible to ensure it would never find her. She had a lot of work to do, on herself, on her company, on the person she wanted to become. But for the first time in 20 years, she believed it was possible. 3 years later, Marcus returned to Chen Manufacturing, not as maintenance. As a senior engineer overseeing all technical innovation, his hire was public, celebrated, announced with full credit to his accomplishments and qualifications. Amara, now 11 years old, attended the announcement. She watched her father stand in front of the company he'd once been invisible in and finally be seen. Victoria attended the announcement from the back of the room. She'd stepped away from the CEO position permanently, working now as a consultant helping other companies restructure their systems to ensure proper credit and protection for vulnerable workers. She'd changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. After the ceremony, Marcus came to speak with her. "Thank you," he said simply, "for changing, for making this possible." "Thank you," Victoria replied, "for showing me what it meant to be worth seeing." And in that moment, standing in a room full of people who'd never been invisible, who'd never had to fight to be recognized, who'd never questioned their right to take up space, they understood each other completely. Not as romantic partners, not as even close friends, but as two people who'd learned something essential about what it meant to see and be seen, to value and be valued, to matter in a world that had been designed to make people like Marcus disappear. And that understanding, that recognition, was enough.